Cole Rush, we are back with another Page to Screen. It's the month before spooky season officially begins, but we're going to be talking about one of the all-time classic horror movies that turns 50 this year. Unbelievable. The
Wow.
Exorcist, 1973, based on the William Peter Blatty novel, directed by William Friedkin, who passed away earlier this year. Um, this is the first time that you've seen The Exorcist and read the novel. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Uh, this is gonna be a very interesting conversation because The Exorcist is one of those films that, when it first came out, it was a revolutionary horror film. It's part of pop culture for a reason, all the memes, and they have, Reagan, McNeil action figures and things like that. But in terms of the actual film, horror has evolved a lot over the last half century as films and genres tend to do. So my question for you tonight is going to be, how were you affected by The Exorcist? Was it scary? Did it mean anything to you as it meant to me, having watched this at way too young an age and revisiting over the course of my life in different eras? So we're going to get into the whole thing, but I wanted to show off. First of all, Warner Brothers just put out a 4K edition of The Exorcist
Oh,
with
wow.
not a great cover image. They replaced the classic movie poster with, ooh, scary Reagan. But yeah, and we would have watched this together, except that I got COVID a couple weeks ago. So unfortunately, but the real find was in a garage sale like 20 years ago. I found a
Ooh,
first edition copy of the Exorcist novel for 50 cents.
there you
Still in
go.
really good condition.
That was cheaper than my mass market paperback.
Wait, was it this one?
Indeed, it was. Yes.
All right,
And now
yeah.
some brave soul who is a patron of my little free library has it.
Nice.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that good or bad? Because you're giving away The Exorcist. Ooh.
Yeah. I mean, my rule with books is if it's not like a 9 out of 10 or above, I give it away. Um,
Whoa.
yeah. And it's just because I have like 500 books and
True.
I like to keep the favorites and I like to spread the love, because my 6 or 7 might be somebody else's 10, um, and that's how I ended up with Aaron. No,
Wow.
I mean that I was probably everybody else's 6 or 7, but I was her 10, and thank goodness I was. Phew.
Nice save.
I know my calves are hurting from backpedaling so much.
All right, so that's a great place to start with the novel because this is Page2Screen. Um, it wasn't a keeper for you. So how close did it get to keeperdom?
I mean, it wasn't all that close. I knew that this going in, I was like, I don't think I'm gonna love this all that much, but I'm excited to give it a shot. And I artfully placed it in between two, like, core fantasy books I had wanted to read. Um, as I like to do when I'm venturing out into the world of genre, as it were. And it was fine. I mean, there were parts of the book that I really enjoyed, particularly Damien Karras's character. I enjoyed kind of like the brief descriptions of Georgetown and the surrounding area. And I kind of like this like Hollywood 70s like glimpse, into that world of kind of hoity-toity parties. And I do think that the book did a really good job with the progression of Reagan's character and subsequent illness. I thought that progression, as I expected, was good in the book and better than in the movie. So yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the book plenty. I think I gave it like a 6.5 out of 10 when I reviewed it. And I stand by that score. I think it falls into the category of like, it's this older book that kind of has that voice that just feels a little bit dated. And that doesn't mean it's bad. It just is not as modern or kind of like, it's not as willing to cross genre lines as some of the more modern stuff is. But I enjoyed that Blatty kind of stuck to what he was going for. And I think that generally he did a good job. There were some things that really put me off about it. And I think my biggest gripe was that Reagan's dialogue sounds like what an old man thinks a kid talks like.
I I'm there with you, and I think that, and it's crazy because Blatty wrote the screenplay. He adapted his own,
Right.
novel, and I think, like, what I don't know if he had help there or what, but that was a big leap forward. I think in terms of the
I agree.
quality, just for the characters writing. But for me, it wasn't so much Reagan because a lot of the novel is her ill or possessed. For
Right.
me, it was Chris McNeil, the mother, who I should have bookmarked some of these, but she very much has that kind of like, gee whiz, ah
Yep. Oh
shucks,
golly.
this is so crummy, yeah, oh golly
Oh golly
dialogue, and
was
I'm
the way
like,
I would describe this sort of vernacular that goes through this book.
yeah, that is kind of off-putting and weird, and it just even seems the type of person she is in the novel. She's a successful Hollywood actress in the early '70s. Even that seemed a bit too Leave It to Beaver to me, especially because as she goes on and her daughter starts to become possessed and have all these like mental and physical breakdowns, she does kind of break out she gets a little bit more foul in her language and a little bit more freaked out. So yeah, there's a bit of a disconnect there. I think Ellen Burstyn's performance, combined with the writing in the film, really sells her as a character in a way that the book doesn't.
Right. Yeah, I think that the book's dialogue, I would describe it as kind of clinical, um, or like sanitized is probably the word I'm looking for. Um, it doesn't feel natural, and I think that this is true of a lot of books from the more exploratory eras of horror and fantasy, where I feel like some of J.R.R. Tolkien's dialogue is kind of stale in that way. But it's because that's just how you wrote back in the day. It was before people kind of learned to incorporate different dialects and such. It's the reason that we have "Ho there, what business?" in medieval fantasies. Um, but I do agree with a point that you kind of touched on there, which is when Reagan becomes possessed, her language takes a stark turn. And so for her character, at least, it provides a really interesting contrast between who she was and whoever is now possessing her. That part I did enjoy, but I agree that, well, also in the book, they probably set out right how old Reagan was, but I pegged her for like 6 based on how he was having her talk. And then in the
Oh,
movie, we watched it, and I was like, Aaron watched it with me, and I was like, she's 12?
you go from the golly gee whiz type stuff to lines like "Your mother sucks cocks in hell, Karras." So I can understand they're trying to make that contrast between the ultimate innocence and the ultimate evil. But I think something, and I'm going to say that it was deliberate, but it's something I never really picked up on in terms of the film. There's an awful lot of blasphemy, I'll call it, in the movie on the part of Chris. Reagan's mother, especially as her world starts falling apart, she's like, Jesus Christ, God damn it, can't someone help me? What the fucking Christ is going on? You know, as someone who, considers themselves a Christian, it is kind of off-putting to hear that. I definitely was a lot more lax in that, years ago, and it didn't bother me. But now I'm like, do you really have to? But at the end, when Father Merrin and Father Karras are performing the exorcism, they're really going at it. They're saying the power of Christ, the power of that word used in the way that it was intended instead of, in the blasphemous sense. It seemed like, I don't know if it was a detail I'd never picked up on or if it was intentional, but it was a really cool kind of contrast.
Yeah, I touched on this in my review as well, actually, and I had kind of like an opposite reaction. I'll say whatever. I'm an atheist to my core, and I don't subscribe to any major religion whatsoever. And if it brings somebody personal peace, by all means, go on and conquer. Well, don't actually conquer. That's not really a good thing. But
Conquer with love.
there's this kind of disconnect for me. And I actually had this with a different book that has no religious themes whatsoever, which I just finished today. And it takes place in the real world. And this guy is kind of thrust into this fish out of water situation where he has to take over his estranged uncle's supervillain business. Um, and I found this interesting problem where like I was having a really hard time suspending my disbelief, because you're meant to believe that this is taking place in the real world, and it feels kind of like an extra heavy lift for an author. Like, yeah, you don't have to do the world building of creating your own fantasy or sci-fi universe, but you also have to justify how this all exists in the real world. And with The Exorcist, I ran into a kind of similar problem, though with a more religious bent, which is like a lot of this stuff, I know it's based very loosely on a true story, but a lot of this stuff kind of requires a little bit of a buy-in to the whole religious culture. Um, doesn't mean I didn't get it or didn't understand, but I was kind of just like shaking my head at a lot of this stuff and thinking, well, like this doesn't really align with my view of the world. So it's hard for me to suspend my disbelief in this particular scenario. Um, but I do have to give Blatty credit because Chris kind of feels like that, where she's not super church going or religious, but this is kind of what brings her into that fold and is like, we need something. Is this anything we can do? And to her, it feels like a last resort. I don't know if this is intentional on Blatty, and the commentary of the novel is, when it comes down to it, you're all going to come to God or something like that. I don't know much about the guy. But I did find that arc interesting. And when I sort of realized that was what was happening, I was like, okay, I can sort of connect myself to this character's experience now, and kind of buy into the quote unquote fantasy of the novel within that context.
It is a fascinating story, and I think it's going to sound weird to say, and I think we've probably talked about certain books and films during this series where I think they're great companion pieces, but having read the novel The Exorcist, I can't look at the movie in the same way. I feel like it needs to be an hour longer to fully capture everything
Yep.
that goes on in the film. It's very uneven in terms of pacing,
Oh my
and
gosh.
well, the only reason my only criticism of that is that, the opening 5-10 minutes is, Max von Sydow as Father Marin walking around northern Iraq. He's on this archaeological dig. They uncover an artifact of the demon Pazuzu, and he feels that he's going to be summoned to go on essentially his last, mission for the church. And that's, very languid. It takes its time. It's beautifully filmed and I think very well acted. But then you get whole chapters of the book that are just like almost taken care of in montage. You're like, no, let's pull over and examine some of this stuff more. There's a whole subplot about, Father Karras, who is a priest living in Georgetown, who is going through a crisis of faith. He is a church psychiatrist or psychologist, working in his parish, kind of advising the other priests, but he doesn't himself, believe anymore. He's struggling. And when it comes to this idea of the exorcism, he doesn't quite believe it because he's rooted in psychology. So he's tasked with trying to help the McNeils by performing an exorcism, which he and some of the other doctors believe will compel whatever bad, mental business is inside of Reagan, because she believes she's possessed. If they perform this ritual, then maybe that will, solve the problem. But in order to be able to do an actual exorcism, you got to get permission from the church, which involves all this proof. And he goes about trying to get this proof, and he starts to believe that, she might actually be possessed. But there's these little stumbling blocks along the way where he's just full of doubt, and it ultimately just has to come down to a matter of faith and a literal leap of faith at the end of the novel and the movie. But we don't really get that, during the film.
Yeah, the movie seems not to concern itself with any of the more mysterious elements of the book, which I find interesting because to me, like the opening of like you kind of know that yeah, it's confirmed she's going to be possessed, like just cultural osmosis there for me. But like there were a lot of mysteries kind of at the heart. Like, is there somebody responsible for like summoning the demon, or is somebody's bad juju sort of like making this possible in this day and time? And I think most of the answers to those questions are no, but you have the whole subplot with Carl and his daughter, whom Willie doesn't know about, which I find extraordinarily compelling because then you wonder, is he somehow responsible? Is he involved in some blasphemous shit and making this happen? And then you have Kinderman, the detective, whose character I think is done dirty in the movie because he has sort of this like, he's kind of this gumshoe detective who's interested in the case, but then he has his own sort of crisis of faith where he's like, I have a duty to protect these people, but I think that what's happening is probably best for them without my intervention. And he ends up having this sort of come to Jesus moment with Karras and is like, do I just need to stay out of this for a couple days? and Karras is like, yes, stay the fuck away. And it sort of works out. And I think that those subplots bring a lot of external context to the story that the movie sort of just eschews completely. And even with those cuts, the movie still loses a lot of what's great about the book, which is Reagan's progression into this illness and this steady sort of build towards it. I think the scene where she pees on the carpet, suddenly Chris is like, oh, she's sick. And it's easy to kind of pass that off as, oh, she's just using that as an excuse for her party guests. But in the book, you have weeks of buildup where little things are happening and you're noticing things about Reagan that aren't quite right. So the journey from, curious happening to full on possession is so truncated in the movie that it just feels stunted and weird. And I can't even pass it off as, oh, this is a horror movie. It's supposed to feel that way, because I read the book and I know that's not how it's supposed to be.
Right. I mean, the makeup effects, I think, on Reagan are pretty amazing.
They're phenomenal. Way ahead of their time.
I think it was Rick Baker who did those. But my problem is, and I grew up watching The Exorcist, so I know exactly what she looks like. I've seen the head turning bit in 1,000 memes, but in the context of the book, I'd kind of forgotten all of that because of the way it's described. It's still horrific, but it's not as supernaturally obvious in the novel. She's got her face is scratched, her lips are chapped, her skin is kind of changing color. She's more emaciated and, almost skeletal. I still have, as a reader, the same kind of doubts in my head that, Karras even has way deep into the story. It was like, I think she's still just really messed up and going through something that can't be, maybe it's something medical that hasn't been discovered yet, but I don't think it's the devil. When he sits down with her in the movie, like one of the first encounters, I'm like, her face is blue, and like, and not in like, oh, she's having a cardiac arrest. It's like she looks like something out of a horror movie. And so there's a little bit of like, you're still struggling with this, huh?
Right. And it all comes so easy in the movie. And that's part of what I liked about the book is, like, for me, as I mentioned earlier, Chris kind of became the insert character for me. And I was like, okay, if I had a kid or if anybody close to me was going through something like this, I would absolutely try to rule out medical stuff first. Like, that would be my first instinct, is to get the best doctors on the case. But in the book, Chris has sort of her own crisis. It's all crises of faith. The whole book is crises of faith. Chris has her own, where she realized she already is untrusting of doctors. And as it goes on, that trust it wanes because they can't find anything. And they're just kind of positing ideas at this point. And they're like, oh yeah, I've heard that like telekinesis is a thing when someone's in a really emotional state, and I get it. This was written in like the late 60s, early 70s. But at those types of unexplained phenomena, it's also, I don't know, it's funny to me watching, these clearly well-educated white men be like, oh yes, it clearly has to be this, because they're afraid to say that they don't know something, which to me is another interesting subplot, because Chris is the one who, despite having little faith, actually stumbles upon the right answer, and then has trouble getting anybody to believe her, even though all the people around her have admitted essentially to not knowing what's happening.
I mean, as far as the scientists go, I mean, yeah, not admitting that they don't know something, it's still a giant leap for them, understandably. Right. It's just
for
like,
sure.
Today, you're not going to get people encountering something unexplained and saying, oh, it must be aliens or it's, the devil. They're probably going to be,
what
stumped.
Today are you living in? Because that seems very likely to me.
Well, I'm talking about in the realm of bedside medicine science, right?
I get you.
Yeah. But that's
because all the doctors are aliens, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, no, I mean, but it's interesting in the novel that there is this acceptance of, the idea of telekinesis being a natural, explainable phenomenon, which, it does sound a bit weird, but I wouldn't necessarily jump to the supernatural anyway, because you hear stories about people who've lost limbs, they can still feel stuff, or, people being able to be hooked up to certain sensors. And I mean, you can do this now where you can move things, with your mind if you've got the right, sensory hookups. So it might have been a bit speculative. It might have been something based in the science of the time. I don't know. But I did like the idea that, perhaps God, in Karras's mind, this mysterious ways and this possession, all that stuff, could have just been a scientific evolutionary step that just hadn't been discovered yet. It's like two steps beyond reach, but it's still possible, more possible than, oh, there was a war in heaven, millions of years ago, and the fallen angel wants to take over people's souls for whatever reason. They never really get into that, in the movie. And I don't really think they get into that in the book. Like, why is he doing this? Why does he want her? It's interesting because it seems more that, Satan or Pazuzu wants Karras, maybe as like a corrupting force. In the novel, it's established that Marin had been involved in a possession, I think in Africa, some decades before, and this demon was actually, or claims to be, the thing that he had encountered previously, and now it wants a rematch. They don't really touch on that in the movie.
Right. This is bringing to mind, just while I have it on the top of my mind, there's a book called Prosper's Demon. It's 100 pages long. It's a novella. And the main character is a nameless exorcist who everybody hates, human and demons alike, because he hurts humans by taking demons out and he hurts the demons. He hates himself. He hates his job. And he encounters this magnate. And the best description I can, come up with is like a Leonardo da Vinci type cultural staple.
Wow.
And he discovers that this person, Prosper, is possessed by a demon. But the demon is directly responsible for all of the cultural accomplishments and artistic accomplishments of this magnate. And the exorcist has to sort of decide what to do. Does he exorcise the demon? Does he kill the guy? What happens here? And it came to mind when I was reading and watching The Exorcist that like this book probably isn't possible without The Exorcist, the movie, and or the novel. And the idea of like where an exorcism story can go owes a lot to what I just read. And I found that idea fascinating, because you made me think of this when you were talking about how it kind of wants Karras. And I was like, that reminds me of The Shining, where the Overlook doesn't want Jack. It wants Danny. And it's sort of like this means to an end. So I think that as a seminal sort of like step in this genre, or in this sort of really unique subcategory of story, The Exorcist is really important, because it has created kind of a lane where these types of ideas can be explored. And that much I really appreciated about the book. The movie, not so much. Kind of shifting gears here, I struggle with horror movies in general. Number one, I'm a little baby and I don't like to be scared, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I couldn't sleep for 2 nights after I watched The Conjuring, so that's about where I'm at. This one did not scare me nearly as much. And I understand that they can be a vehicle for interesting stories and explorations of the human condition and blah, 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 but so can every story. And like the whole like being scared thing just never hooks me. It's not a like selling point that somebody can come to me with and like I'm like, oh yes, I'm convinced. And I think that's where I struggle with this, is like I get a little bit bored with the ideas. And then I finish it and I'm like, no, that was an interesting story, but was it good to me? Did I like it? And that's where I struggle.
I understand. This is sort of my struggle with the Exorcist preparing for this show, because there's so much in the novel that defines the characters and really underscores their struggle without hitting us over the head with it, that there's just no time for in the film. Um, there's a whole bit of business with Burke Dennings, this
Yeah.
Hollywood director that's Chris's director on this film that they're making in Georgetown, and he's a drunk. He's really got it in for the Swiss house, man of the house, I guess, Chris's servants. Carl keeps referring to him as a Nazi bastard and a Hun and all that stuff, kind of ribbing him, almost thinking like, oh, he escaped from the war, now he's hiding out and working for this nice actress. Uh, Burke is murdered. It's a bit of foreshadowing because he falls to his death on the steps behind Chris McNeil's apartment. And it's established that when Chris was out, Burke was at home with Reagan, and that's when he died. Turns out he had gone up to her room, and Reagan lurched out at him, twisted his neck all the way around and then shoved him out the open window. That's when he fell down the steps and they discovered his body later. But so much of the first third of this book, I feel like, was Chris trying to cover up for what her daughter did and the guilt of that and the shame. And when Karras is like, he keeps coming back at her, and even Kinderman saying, like, do you have anything, if we're dealing with an actual demon, it's going to know everything. It's going to use the truth against you. It's going to uncover, lies and secrets and stuff. So if you have something, spit it out. And she just can't bring herself to do it because she's so concerned with her daughter. Part of it is her own reputation as an actress, I think. Like, what's this going to do if people find out my daughter killed someone? There's just so many layers to what's going on in Chris's mind as just a subplot of this story that is completely glossed over, in the book. In the novel, there's a great scene where Karras goes to, or no, I think it's Kinderman goes to the morgue and looks at Burke Denning's body, and that's when we find out that the head was twisted all the way around. In the movie, it's done with a piece of dialogue between Kinderman and Karras, on the track. I'm like, it works, I guess, because the performances are great, but that chilling scene is painted in the novel is just, I wonder what that looks like, but I'm never going to know because they didn't shoot that for the film.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And there's something about Chris that kind of delights me in a way because like some of her inner monologue, or not even inner monologue, some of her interactions in the book are rather hilarious. Like there's I think there's a scene where she wants to buy a new Jaguar, a car, and she talks to her business manager and was like, "Can I just like grab one?" And he's like, "Well, you'd have to do another picture, And she's like, she's gonna sign on to direct or something. Um, and I think that those kind of moments do a lot of legwork in the book because like they paint a picture of yeah, she's rich and she does well, but like she's not a bank. Um, and this besides the emotional trauma and the fear of losing her daughter also just like disrupts their entire life. And you really start to feel bad for Chris because you realize early on that the husband or her ex-husband isn't around anymore, Reagan's father. He barely calls. It's like moving mountains to get him to interact with his daughter. Um, and despite having a life of, relative privilege, they still have a lot of struggles. And there's kind of in the movie, there's kind of like a glimpse, I think, where it seems to me like Chris struggles a little bit to connect with Reagan, and she's kind of like putting forth ideas for what to do. And Reagan gets really excited about him. Oh, yeah, we'll go see a movie. We'll do this. But to me, it's kind of this image of we know this girl is damaged by the divorce, and Chris is doing her best, but there's something darker lingering there. So it just makes the possession as bad as it already is, like that much fucking worse. It's not a great thing for them, and it sort of just like disrupts everything around them. But what is just so surprising to me, and Aaron and I discussed this, is if I was Carl or Willie or Sharon, I would be so far away so fast. If any of this shit started happening to me, I'd be on the moon. You could not find me if you paid $1 billion. If you could sell 18 Jaguar cars and the money you get would not be able to find me through a private investigator. Like, just I am out of there. And they all stand by her. Which is super interesting when juxtaposed against this struggle that she's going through. Like, she does have people she loves and she has this sort of found family. And I just wonder, like, are they paying? Is she paying them like a ton of money and they're just like, well, this is worth it. Like, may as well. Or do they love her all that much? I don't really know. I don't know the answer.
They don't really touch on that in the book, but the vibe I got, and it comes across more in the novel too. Um, I think the answer to your question is in the book, not so much the film, because there, as you mentioned, there's that whole subplot of Carl and
With
Willie's
Carl,
daughter.
yeah.
I mean, to the point where you talk about family secrets, Carl made Willie believe that their daughter was dead and had been dead for decades, when in truth she's a junkie living like across town on in the slum, and he's been like quietly paying her off and essentially paying for her drugs. Um, but it's not a big leap to see if they've been with the McNeils since Reagan was born. they probably consider her to be like their daughter or their granddaughter. Same thing with Sharon. You get the idea that she's been an assistant and a friend and a confidant to Chris for a long time. So it would have been interesting, I think, to see some of that conflict. But another thing the book does really well is show how involved they are with Regan. In the novel, Regan's is always in the room by herself. In the book, there's constantly scenes of like, oh, Chris comes home, or Father Karras goes, up to visit, and Carl was sitting in the room like wrapped in blankets because it's sub-zero temperatures and stuff. He's sitting in there with that fucking monster, like God knows what it's saying to him. So yeah, it goes beyond friendship and found family. There's something more profound there, but they don't explicitly go into it. It's just kind of left for us to imagine what that dynamic was like.
Right. And to me, this is the mark of a bad adaptation. If you can't convey the ideas, because listen, I understand you don't have 360 some pages to tell your story in a movie, but you have entire shots and actors, and there are different ways to convey these things in small moments. And I think it's to your point that you made at the very beginning, which is kind of like this movie kind of languishes on these certain shots that just become a bit stale and dull. And some of it I chalk up to my attention span as a modern viewer, right? Like I need quick cuts and lots of Thanos and Thor hammers, of course. But like there is a certain patience that is required for these movies. And as a modern viewer, I get really upset if I don't feel like it pays off. And in some ways, I feel like we're sort of setting ourselves up for this disappointment because we're reading the book when we know full well it's probably going to be better than the movie. That's just like, there's a reason that adage exists. But at the same time, I think we've seen some pretty successful adaptations in our day. And I think it's proven that like the tools available to movie makers and novelists sometimes overlap, but are widely different in other cases. And too many cooks can result in a disastrous failure or a raving success. And I think that for me, the Exorcist movie kind of falls slightly on the side of disaster. I don't think that it is fully a disaster. I think it's fine, but it just doesn't hit the mark in the ways that it could have. And I think the reason for my big disappointment there is, didn't Blatty write the screenplay?
Yeah.
So I'm like, bro, you had all the stuff you needed. What happened? Where did it all go?
Well, I mean, some of that probably is, Warner Brothers as a studio.
True.
I mean, yes, you can put out a 3-hour movie because they did a lot of that in the 1970s. I mean, look at The Godfather, which came out, oh my gosh, yeah, the year before this. Before we started this, I explicitly said, watch the theatrical cut and not the director's cut, also known as the version you've never seen, which came out, I think, 30 years ago or 20. Um, and that's because there is material that was in the book that is included in those kind of cut scenes, but I only watched that version once, and it was upsetting to me because The Exorcist, I think, I think it's an excellent movie. It Mileage may vary based on some of the things that we've talked about. The age you were when you first saw it, the kind of cultural environment you grew up in, like how much has horror evolved since it first came out. But the scenes that they added in were just so funny. I remember like the entire theater I went to see it with on opening weekend was just laughing their asses off at the new material because like there's a scene where Regan, when she first goes to the doctor with Chris, the doctor said, "Regan, I want to prescribe you a drug that we've just discovered called Ritalin," and everyone was like, "What the fuck?" And then the spider walk sequence, which it's earlier on in the novel, but Regan comes like she's like bent over, kind of crawling down the stairs,
Right.
and there's a really chilling last line of that chapter where it's like Sharon turned around and saw that Regan was licking at her heels. I'm like, "Ugh, give me the willies." The reality of watching that scene, it's like all sped up. It looks like almost bad, like stop motion animation. It's terrible. But I'm like, I would rather just see, another hour of the character development and fleshing out some of those subplots, but I guess it just wasn't in the cards, even though, the novel was very successful. Warner Brothers, I guess, was taking a chance on it. But, fortunately, we have, 2 Exorcist sequels, 2 prequels, and a sequel coming out next month. Yay.
Yeah, I very briefly Googled just to see, like, and I was like, oh wow, there's a whole cinematic universe. There's another one we don't need.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like my big takeaway from this movie is I always thought of The Exorcist as somehow pertaining to Reagan and the demon, the little, possessed girl and the head spinning around the pea soup and all that. But it really is about Damien Karras. It's not even about Father Marin, who
Yep.
is the official exorcist. This is about Karras and his journey, which I think is just, it's really lovely. And Jason Miller, who's the actor who plays him, I think he's got one of the most, like, haunted faces I've ever seen
Yeah.
in any actor, and he's just so tremendous. I believed that I was watching a man. I almost felt like I was watching an actor who was also having an actual existential crisis of faith, making a movie about a guy who is going through the same thing, so he was doubly fucked up. It's so good.
Yeah, I completely agree. I didn't know who the actor was, but I was drawn to him, and that was a point I wanted to make. So I'm really glad you brought it up. Is that like this is really Damien's story, and I think the book does that justice. The movie tries at it and doesn't quite succeed as much. Um, but I do want to talk about the ending, and hopefully people are well aware of spoilers from this 50-year-old movie. Um, but there was a moment like a lot of the first half of the book focuses on Chris, and you get some Damien stuff in there, and it is there. I don't want to say it's not, but like then the latter half, it's really Damien's story. That's when it kind of like becomes his, in my opinion. Um, so about halfway through when this shift happened, I was like, oh shit, he's gonna take the demon. Like that's what's gonna happen here. And I didn't know how or why or when it was gonna happen, but I was like, that's the climax. And if it's not, this book's gonna suck. So this is my brighter brain coming out. I'm like, okay, I gotta have this story beat. So when it happened, I was immensely satisfied and I truly adored the ending. Um, it just felt right for this sort of like, priest who was unsure of his faith to take his own life essentially for this girl who was clearly going to die. Um, and it's obviously tragic and it's sad. Um, but there's like a hint of brightness to it because his inner conflict is resolved. The sad part is it's 99% sad because he dies. But it's for me there's 1% there of happiness because like he realizes that he's done right by somebody and has resolved a part of whatever he was struggling with in his mind. And I think that's an important part of his character. I think it's really cool.
There's a lot going on with that closing scene or that climactic scene where he I think it's pretty close in the book and the film, but he essentially is in the room with Father Marin, who has, he's traveled. He came back from Iraq. He was hanging out in the States for like 4 months, and then he gets his orders by the church to go to Georgetown and participate in this ritual. He shows up, meets Chris and Father Karras, and it's like late at night, and so there's sort of like this idea that okay, well, there's your room. We'll get started in the morning, whatever. But he's like, no, we need to do this tonight, like right now. Go get me the go get me the robes and the holy water and all this stuff. We're just gonna go. And you know, Father Marin is very old and he's taking heart pills. And at one point, he dismisses Damien from the room because he starts getting overly emotional because the demon is taunting him and everything. And when he comes back in later, Marin's dead. He's just laying there, had a heart attack, for whether it was something the demon did to him or if he was just like overcome by his age and the anxiety or the lateness of the hour, whatever. And then Karras kind of loses it. It's like it's almost like as it at the moment because the demon has been tormenting Karras with throwing voices at him like his mother, guilting him for not being there for him or for her. There's a homeless guy who said, can you spare a quarter for an altar boy fada? And he's kind of ignored him. All of this stuff he's throwing at him. Karras has been constantly trying to write it off as like, it's just a coincidence. Maybe if there's telekinesis, maybe he can read my mind or something like that. I don't know what's going on here. But in that moment, when he sees what happened to Marin, a person that he had only just met but had admired for a long time because of I think it was, I can't remember exactly how they put it in the novel, but Marin was he was a very spiritual, religious man, but he wrote in terms of like bringing faith and science together, and he wrote very poetically. But Karras kind of snaps, I think, when he sees that this monster has killed this, bright, this symbol of, everything that's good. And at that point, I think he's like, I don't care if you're the devil or if you're just like, if you're just a not very nice little girl who's causing a lot of people this heartache, whatever is in you, try me. Like you think you think you're tough, you're picking on a little 12-year-old girl and an old man, come take me. And in the movie, the demon jumps into him, and we see it kind of change from the kind of the green-faced, yellow-eyed guy back to Karras for like a split second, and then back into the demon right before it jumps into the window. And I like to think that at that moment, that was, I'm going to use the language. I think that was God's gift, his final gift to Karras, the proof that he needed that he really was engaged in a struggle against evil, because now this thing was inside of him, and also gave him an out. Like, yeah, now you can do what you need to do to cast this thing out. And, he ultimately sacrificed himself. It's a great moment, I think, followed up by a better moment, which is one of Karras's best friends at the church, Father Dyer, encounters him on the steps, and the crowd is gathering, and there's blood all over the sidewalk, and he kneels down, and Dyer is crying. And I was really invested in this moment with this actor, and he's grabbing Karras's hand, and Karras can't talk. All he can do is like squeeze his fingers, and Dyer's like, do you repent for all your sins, and like giving him this last chance to go to heaven. And it's just, when I think of The Exorcist, that's what I think of. I don't think of the pea soup and the head spinning around. This is a beautiful movie. I barely think it's a horror movie.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's a very character driven movie, which I think is what lends it that sort of pastiche. Yeah, it's also funny that Father Dyer is named Dyer, but Karras is the one that dies, and Father Dyer is the one that cares.
Oh my God.
So now you hate The Exorcist. You're welcome.
No, now I love The Exorcist, but I'm never going to be able to not think about that. And you got me to blaspheme. So here, do you know that there was Blatty wrote a follow-up novel to The Exorcist?
I did not.
Called Legion, which they adapted as Exorcist 3 Legion in 1990. Would it surprise you to know that Father Karras, and I haven't seen the movie in like 3 decades, so this is my memory of it, but do you know that Father Karras didn't actually die in those steps?
Oh, of course. See,
I
like
think
that just ruins it.
yeah, he got, I guess, locked up in an asylum, and then 30 years later, there's a serial killer, that there's also a demon, and all sorts of crazy stuff comes on, and Kinderman shows back up, and he's like the hero of the movie.
I just don't get it. I mean, I get it. They want to make money, but poetic character endings are better and longer lasting than any money ever was.
Eddie Money? Oh,
Yep.
Any Money. Okay. No,
Get out of my dreams and into my car. I don't even know if that's Eddie Money.
That was Billy Ocean, dude. Come on.
These guys with names that end in an E sound and then are just objects afterwards, like they get so confused, man. What can I say? Rob Zombie? Are you kidding me?
My God. Now I'm just thinking Rob Zombie's Get Out of My Dreams, Get Into My Car. No, okay. Yeah. Okay. I gotta say, the one, you kind of criticized it earlier, but I think one of the triumphs of this adaptation on Friedkin's part is the portrayal of Kinderman, because one of the bad things about the novel is he's an annoying character, and he likes being, he loves the movies, he considers himself a film critic, he's a complete fame whore, he loves being around Chris McNeil and helping out. But man, the pages and pages of dialogue, I get it, because he's really testing the patience of everyone he meets, but he's testing my patience. Like, he'll knock on someone's door and then start randomly talking about movies, and Chris is like, what the fuck are you doing here? My daughter is going crazy. Do you have a point to make? Oh my God. So he's much more restrained in the film, I think.
Yeah, and you see less of him too. um, which I think helps.
But, any, I guess, closing thoughts on The Exorcist, 50 years of terror?
No, I think we covered everything I wanted to cover. It was I think this was a fun experience for me. Um, a genre I'm not familiar with, interesting book, interesting adaptation, and I think it's the most fun for me in these talks when there's some good stuff and some bad. You know, it's so kind of boring to just pan something unilaterally or praise it unilaterally, and this kind of struck that balance right down the middle.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience because again, I watched this when I was way too young. My parents are huge fans of this movie, and I think it traumatized me in some ways, and it certainly traumatized Linda Blair, who played Reagan McNeil. There's, she was famously like put through hell making this movie. The one thing I do want to touch on and see how this affected you or didn't affect you, the special effects in this movie, the head turning around, you can see how they did that, but at the end, during the exorcism proper, when Reagan is lifted off, she's kind of cruciform lifted off the bed, and you can see Karras and Marin underneath her, and she's hovering, and we get a really good shot. Like, there are no wires here, or at least none that we can see. Did that impress you? Because I'm sitting there watching this, like, I never really picked up on this, but this is not, CGI. I don't know how the hell they did this.
Right. No, that stuff is absolutely impressive to me, you know, especially considering the temporal context, to use some highfalutin words. But no, I find that stuff very interesting, and I've watched a few YouTube videos recently where like magicians talk about consulting on movies, and I think that is, it's not really a dying art because it still happens, but I think that sort of stuff is fascinating because you're hiring people who know how to make illusions. And I have to wonder if there was some sort of magic consultant or special effects consultant that was able to make that possible within the budget and also make it look that good. Um, yeah, that was a thought I had around a lot of the special effects and the makeup and such. I was like, okay, they did a good job, and this sort of thing holds up. Whereas we know that CGI in however many years will not. And I can always appreciate the artfulness that goes into something like that in an older movie.
Last thing I'll touch on, because it's something I don't think you can talk about The Exorcist without addressing it. Did you pick up on the subliminal imagery of the white-faced Pazuzu monster, the
Yeah,
demon?
where it would like flash on the screen here and there. It was
Yeah.
kind of like when Fight Club does the flashing dicks here and there.
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that, and I thought it was a nice touch. And that's a good example of like there are a lot of good things about the movie, and that's one of them. The people come together to kind of make it the a sum of its parts rather than just, you know, a novel which is written by one person and presumably edited and helped out along the way, but is much more of a singular vision than a movie. So that kind of stuff is super interesting as well.
And that was something that I think they added to that director's cut from years ago. They put more demon faces in, because I was watching a YouTube essay about the Pazuzu face and like its significance and how it, its effect on the audience and stuff. And they showed all these examples of it. And as I'm watching the 4K, I'm going back and rewinding, like, wait a second, that face wasn't in there. But I was watching the theatrical version. So I think they went and they put a lot of stuff in. In fact, at the very end, I think this is only in the newer version, before Karras jumps out the window, we see a shot of it, like the curtains blowing and all that. In the new version, they superimpose an image of his mother's face right over the curtains right before he jumps out the window. Like, that's kind of a cool idea. I don't know what it really buys you, and it just smacks of, I know it's the director's cut and everything, but in this case, I'm like, if it wasn't in the original, I don't think I can really count it.
Yep. You mentioned a YouTube video essay. There's one I watched recently by one of my favorite essayists about the value of director's cuts. Um, and it has convinced me that they are valueless. So I don't even remember if that was his thesis, but that's what I came away with. So I will email it to you. I think you'll find it fascinating. This guy's a really good, you know, critic of media, but that one in particular was quite intriguing.
Yeah,
Um,
send it to me. I'll watch it, and I'll even link it down below so everyone can enjoy it, because I'm fascinated by that stuff.
Absolutely will do. And then we'll release the director's cut of this episode because you have to edit out all the times we froze.
Yes, this episode, folks, was actually 6 hours long, but my internet connection, yeah, damn it. Anyway, but hopefully you won't notice or well, you'll probably notice the cuts, but there won't be any, like, lag or freezing. Yeah, Cole, what have you been up to lately? Where can people see your stuff and what do you got to plug?
As always, my work is available at tor.com and thequilltolive.com. That's where I write about fantasy books and fun stuff. I recently did a post about 5 fantasy swordsmen who would cut me down with just one swing. Um, Spoiler alert, there are many, but I just picked 5. Um, and that one is interlaced with harrowing tales of my physical foibles as a youth. So maybe 2 or 3, not a ton, but still fun enough. And if you want to watch me make a fool of myself, that's a good post to read. But otherwise, all the usual places.
All right. Well, we will. Again, thank you for reading the novel and watching the movie and talking about it with me. For next month's movie, which is going to be Kill Bill,
Ooh,
Volume
yes.
One. I don't know if we'll watch both of them. We'll definitely watch the first one because they were released in 2 separate parts across, I think, 1 or 2 years. But yeah, I think we got to watch that one in person because I got to watch your reaction to some of that Tarantino goodness with
I'm very
Uma Thurman
excited.
wielding a sword.
And I'm
Yeah.
wearing my black and yellow leather bodysuit.
Right now, it looks like you're wearing a purple shirt.
Oh, I'm saving it for you, baby.
I haven't stopped the recording yet, Cole. Anyway, all right, man. Thanks a lot. Take care. And folks out there, thank you for watching this. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications so you'll see when we're putting up stuff. And until next time, whenever that is, whatever that is, thanks very much and take care.
Fairly well.